Now that the background is established, it's time to address problems with the typological approach, so problems with racial classification, and that race does not equal human biological variation. So there is observable variation. It is difficult to fail to notice that there are differences between individuals. So one's eyes will easily identify that humans vary biologically, noting differences in height, nose shape, chin prominence, etc. Now, race as a typological approach, just to review, was the dominant means of understanding human biological variation until relatively recently. And it's a system of categorizing observed phenotypic traits into discrete categories. And it links these phenotypic traits with specific behaviors. And the impact of the typological approach is that it provided scientific and cultural justification for the commitment of some of the most atrocious acts in human history. And it continues to provide cultural justification for the perpetuation of inequalities and discrimination. However, there are a lot of problems with the typological approach. Race cannot adequately describe nor explain human biological variation. And there's been a lot of critique against race for the following reasons. Race is non-evolutionary, human variation is continuous, traits vary independently, racial classification minimizes the amount of actual variation, and racial classification is inconsistent. So race is non-evolutionary. Race, being typological, structures variation as static and unchanging, and it ignores genetic and non-genetic adaptation to the environment. Evolution, not race, provides a causal explanation for diversity. Now, human variation is continuous. Both observed phenotypic traits such as skin color and underlying variations in DNA vary among gradients. So there are no clear demarcations in traits between populations. A perfect example of this is skin color in that it forms a gradient from the poles to the equator. Now, traits typically vary independently. Traits used in racial classification have little ability to predict the presence of other traits. For example, skin color is associated to some degree with hair and eye color. However, skin color does not provide any ability to predict blood type or genetic diseases like sickle cell anemia. So in other words, variation of one trait is not dependent on the variation of another trait. Racial classification also minimizes the amount of actual variation. So genetic variation is greater within a racial group than between groups. So for example, two individuals classified as African American in the United States have more genetic differences than do African Americans as a group from European Americans as a group. And finally, racial classification is inconsistent. So it's affected by local cultural definitions of race. For example, the Roma are considered to be a dark race in Romania, but Roma immigrants in the United States are classified as white. So the racial classifications are dependent also on which traits are used to define the classification. Historically, the differences between Linnaeus's 4 races and Blumenbach's 5 races illustrate how traits dictate how the classification operates. So ultimately, the division into racial categories is arbitrary. So the takeaway conclusions of this is that race is insufficient to describe or explain human biological variation. Race is not biological, but is entirely cultural. The concept of race is extremely powerful in that it has real biological consequences. So for example, African Americans tend to have higher blood pressure than European Americans. This is not the result of some innate biological differences between European and African races. This is the result of continued disparities in access to healthcare between European Americans and African Americans due to a culturally perceived and reinforced notion of race and racism. So human biological variation, then, is best described and explained causally by evolutionary theory.